It is my pleasure to welcome Diana Goetsch this afternoon to talk about her gorgeous memoir, This Body I Wore, which chronicles her journey to coming out, a path that runs parallel to the emergence of the trans community over the past several decades. Goetsch is an award-winning poet and essayist, which is evident in the prose. The New York Times called this an achingly beautiful memoir about a trans woman's often vexed relationship with her own body. I read this when it first came out in hardcover last year, and I've named it many times as one of the best books that I read last year. So I'm very excited that we were able to bring Diana here for the paperback launch. Her poems have appeared in many publications, including The New Yorker, Poetry, the Gettysburg Review, and Best American Poetry. And she wrote the Life in Transition blog at the American Scholar. She's won fellowships from the National Endowment for the Arts and from the New School, and she worked for 21 years as a New York City public school teacher. We're going to begin the event by having Diana read for a few minutes, and then after that, I'm going to be in conversation with her, and then we will take questions from all of you. So please help me welcome Diana Goetsch.
Thank you, Susan, and thank you, the staff at Politics and Prose. And this is a bookstore that speaks for itself. The name speaks for itself, and it's really an honor to be here. I've written poems in the basement here. I felt honored at that point as well. So what I thought I'd do is read for maybe about 10 minutes and two little chunks, one from the prologue, because it won't need an introduction because it's the prologue, and then part of another chapter, and so I'll just begin. Stepping out, 1987. One hot summer day, crossing a street in Brooklyn, I thought, maybe it would be better if I were dead. The thought had never visited me before, and yet I knew why it was here. I'd run out of road. On the surface, my life may have appeared promising. I was 24, healthy, and had just begun a career as an English teacher at Stuyvesant High School. But inside, I felt desolate. After 2 years in New York City, I didn't have one close friend. My attempts at romantic relationships had all ended before we'd even had sex. My isolation made no sense to me. It felt like a punishment in a bad dream that didn't include the crime I was being punished for. I envied people I saw together, laughing on park benches, at sidewalk restaurant tables, playing tennis in Central Park, lined up outside the Beacon Theater. I overheard two people on the subway making plans to go to the beach, and it lacerated me. A childhood friend wrote to tell me her husband had suffered a collapsed lung, and I even envied her, fretting in a hospital waiting room with more purpose to her life than I could fathom. But here was something new, albeit morbid. Maybe it would be better if I were dead. And on the heels of that thought came another. If you're going to die, you might as well step out once as a woman. The two thoughts had hit me in the time it took to cross Adams Street, a 4-lane highway that led to the Brooklyn Bridge. I did an about-face, recrossed those lanes and headed to a women's shoe store off the Fulton Street Mall. I'd passed that store many times, noting a sign advertising wide sizes. "We get men in here all the time," said a young salesgirl mercifully. I selected a pair of cream-colored pumps. The salesgirl brought me to a chair near the stockroom, away from the windows, and handed me 2 nylon footies. My heart, which had been racing in fear, shifted into excitement. The pumps fit snugly. I looked down amazed. The arch of my instep looked just like a woman's. I took a few steps and walked quite easily, even though I'd never walked in heels. And I'll skip ahead to a couple places. Shaving my legs in the bathtub felt ecstatic and illicit. With each stroke of the blade, I feared the authorities would storm in and arrest me for a crime against nature. My calves and knees looked surreal in their hairlessness, while the startling amount of body hair swirling on top of the soapy bath water threatened to clog the drain. After getting dressed, I took down a heavy round mirror from the wall and propped it against a door frame to behold my whole body from a strange angle, turning this way and that. I had on a long-sleeved gold lame blouse and matching skirt to go with the cream pumps. I actually thought I looked great. I planned to go to the Eulenspiegel Society, an S&M association whose gatherings on East 4th Street I'd seen advertised regularly in the back pages of the Village Voice. Cruelty didn't turn me on, but sissies were explicitly welcome there and no doubt fit into any number of role-play scenarios. Those didn't interest me either, but if someone offered to lick my shoes, I'd figure out how to deal with it. When the car arrived, there was already a passenger in it, a woman also going to Manhattan. "Where is he going?" she said to the driver, not one bit happy when I joined her in the back seat. I didn't say anything or look at her. If she called me a pervert, I wasn't sure I could honestly disagree. Being out in women's clothes was moment by moment the biggest turn-on I'd ever experienced. The car pulled up to a curb in Lower Manhattan to drop off my disgusted fellow passenger. I glanced at her as she climbed out, a frail lady in black. I was alone now, being driven through Manhattan at night. I thought of all the times I'd gazed at women hailing cabs on the avenues of New York. Ladies in dresses and coiffed hair, young women in aerobics tights with thick ponytails, business women in sheer stockings and pumps, red nails on a door handle, a symphony of bend and swivel, shift and pivot, keeping legs together, settling like a bird in a nest, then safely shutting the door as they tell the driver their address. Witnessing this, or any moment from a woman's day, smoothing a skirt, checking lipstick in a mirror, could put me in a stupor. Whoever the particular woman was, she was likely having a day full of ordinary worries and distractions, though I couldn't shake the belief that all women were citizens of a better world, living superior lives, moment by moment, simply because they were women. And now I was one of them. Sort of. Approximately. Enough, anyway, for people on the street to assume there was a female passenger in the back seat of a car rolling by in the night. I looked down at my hairless legs, glowing and dimming with each passing street light. I rested a hand on my thigh, which sent shudders of pleasure through me. I recrossed my legs, felt flesh rubbing flesh through nylon, and shut my eyes in ecstasy. We pulled up to the curb on East 4th Street. I paid the driver, thanked him in a falsetto British accent, and stepped out into the night. Walking to the door of the Eulenspiegel Society, I was too consumed with every sensation and footfall, and with all that awaited me, to register something every bit as momentous. I might have just saved my own life. So that's a little from the prologue, and I thought I would just read one other snippet and then enjoy a conversation with the wonderful Susan Coll. So I plunge into this cross-dressing subculture in New York City that in the mid to late 80s to 90s that I have never since seen written about, in narrative nonfiction. And at the time I was also teaching at Stuyvesant High School. And after the so-called trans tipping point, I looked back on that experience as truly bizarre and yet at the time, it's just your life. You don't feel like you're in history. And I also am pretty sure that most of these people were trans and didn't know it. So this is a passage called, a chapter called The Fabric Factory, 1987. So it's like a year later, after the prologue. The Fabric Factory bar on West 41st Street has a dressing room in the basement for men who arrive in trousers and polo shirts, carrying duffel bags, and appear an hour later at the top of the stairs in gowns or skirt suits, teetering in high heels like newborn cults. Though most arrive already dressed as women, they come from as far as Pennsylvania and Massachusetts. They have shaved and prepped themselves all afternoon, appropriated clothes from their wives' closets, snuck out to their cars at dusk, braved the stares of highway toll takers, risked getting pulled over by troopers. By midnight, they have 5 o'clock shadows. I take the subway from Brooklyn. I'm safe on mass transit, I tell myself, as long as I go all out, like an actor who fully commits. Even if the material is flawed, people respect the effort. Some writers look at me, then look away. And those who don't notice me at all, well, that's even better. I dress like an ordinary woman coming from work. Most cross-dressers overdo it in some way. A crazy wig or garish makeup, a too tight outfit, or stiletto slingbacks they can't manage. Not that I don't respect whatever turns them on. I just happen to be turned on by blending. I'd like, with my first step inside the Fabric Factory, to be seen as a woman who entered the wrong bar. There's a contingent of Filipino pre-ops who hang out near the front window. They wear little slinky dresses and speak to each other in rapid-fire Tagalog while tossing their hair and checking themselves in compact mirrors. There are TVs from a suburban New Jersey support group who drink together in a small pack and seem like they could be tailgating at Giant Stadium. There's Vicky from Long Beach, who supports an aging mother and a kid in college by working a security job. She wears see-through tops and miniskirts over bare legs and speaks in a saccharine falsetto. There's Adele, a married TV, who is smart and stable and 10 years my senior. She's neither ugly nor stunning, wears designer labels, is quite ladylike and fairly passable. I like talking to Adele. Sometimes she brings her wife, Mara, who is plump with a pretty face and is often the only GG, genetic girl, in the bar. She and Mara have no children and use an entire bedroom of their house as a closet. I picture aisles of stylish clothes like a small store the two of them share. Stephanie from Long Island wears fake dagger-like nails, a long black wig, heavy makeup, and super short skirts, but cancels these efforts by walking and talking like a building contractor in stilettos, which she is. She shows up maybe once a month, drinks a lot, and discusses her truck. We envy her size 7.5 feet. Kayla, young, tall, and pretty, visits from Tennessee a few times a year. She is on a mission to compete in drag beauty pageants and is on hormones to grow breasts to help the cause. After she wins one, she swears she'll stop the hormones. She's unbuttoned her blouse just low enough to display smooth chest flesh and the budding of some cleavage, a sight that fills me with shock and envy. In Tennessee, Kayla lives as a man named Ken, who binds his breasts in ace bandages to patrol center field for his company's softball team. Stan, a Vietnam vet, wears Mary Jane flats, a black pageboy wig, a shapeless cotton frock, and has no girl name. The first time I saw him, he was handcuffed to a young black woman who hardly spoke. I couldn't quite figure out their dynamic. There are drag queens who drop by after midnight shows at Hell's Kitchen bars. Gay boys as tall as NBA forwards who wear hip pads and butt pads and have racks you could fold laundry on. They talk exclusively to one another as if they are royalty. If we're lucky, we may get a visit from International Crisis, who is royalty. Salvador Dali's one-time transsexual muse, often seen on page 6 of the New York Post and rumored to be dating some Hollywood actor, Crisis trails her entourage of taciturn queers, her red cheeks puffed around a small chiseled nose, her cleavage carved deep from mail-order progesterone that will overtake her liver in 2 years' time. We come to the fabric factory like animals to water, whether we drink or not, whether we mingle or dance or sit alone in a corner, just enjoying the feeling of being in our clothes, we are nourished. Every time we hear the pronoun she and realize it's us, there's a shock and shiver of life. And I'll just read one other section of this, one other paragraph. So we've been reporting to each other on the places we go. We trade these secrets, how we do this, what excuses we make to our family, et cetera, et cetera. In the months since stepping out for the first time, I have been nearly all the places we're talking about, though there is nothing quite like the fabric factory, eclectic, warm, and welcoming. Like your first Little League field, it is both a home and a destination. A man can wander aimlessly in a city at night, but a lady needs a destination. During the week, garment district executives come here to drink their lunches, but every Saturday night, the fabric factory is ours, and the disco ball in the middle of the ceiling shines its ever-receding facets on the faces of people we are 20 years away from having any respectable words for. Thank you.
Well, thank you for, whoops.
Oh, that was what I'm supposed to be holding.
Yes. At least we know it's on. Oh, wait, let me get you this.
Bad rehearsal, good performance. What did I do now? Did I
This.
break your... Oh my
No,
God.
we're good.
I broke the bookstore. I broke Politics and Prose. This is horrible.
Well, that was a great reading, and you ended on the perfect note for the first thing I wanted to talk to you about, which was language and the language in the pre-internet days and how hard it was to sort of find information about what you were experiencing. So can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I didn't used to believe this about language, but I do now. If you don't have the language, you don't have the perception. It's very contrary to Zen Buddhism, which I got into as a young person, which, you know, the goal is to see reality without language. Language being abstract, you know, like what is the chair before you say the word chair? If you can glimpse that, somehow you're seeing reality. But I think in interpersonal things, in human things, if you don't have the words, you do not have the perception. And I haven't figured out why, but I wrote myself into that realization. So the book starts with this disclaimer about language, and I didn't want it to just be a trigger warning or anything like that. I really wanted it to be a claim, you know, stylistically, that I'm not going to impose current terms onto a past reality, because then you might lose the reality. And the reality is we were steering by echolocation. We had every word but the right word. So yeah, I too wanted that line, because I knew I was saying these things in what I was reading that were you know, transphobic, frankly. But we were 20 years away from having any respectable words for ourselves.
Yeah, I also was fascinated by sort of the lack of resources, not just language, but like you described having to go into porn shops to look at magazines that just had pictures of women wearing pearls and, you know, high top dresses. Yeah. So, yeah.
Well, yeah, and it was, I mean, still today, trans people are very much sexualized, but even more so then. You know, I mean, with current politics today, if you're trans, it equals porn or something. You know, they want to sell this. But back then, you know, you just went where they would have you. And a lot of times it was what I called rough approximations, you know, porn shops, S&M clubs, you know, spaces that were gay, you know, even though you weren't. But it's like they could take you and you didn't know what to call yourself anyway. And at one point with the porn stores, I just said, what are these magazines doing in porn shops? I mean, I'm here thumbing through like some ashamed male, you know, this, you know, my proclivity, you know, my stack at the table, and some other dude is there with, you know, people in uniforms or people who like people to urinate on them. And, you know, it's fine with me, you know, but we're all having our little thing there in the porn shop. And then they give you what you want in these taped up paper, unmarked packages, you know. And
Yeah, and then you described the experience of going to the New York Public Library finally, and yeah, can you tell everyone about that?
yeah, you research. I think the phrase is, I went to the New York Public Library to research my fucked up self. I can't even say my gender identity because we didn't have that word. So, and basically what there was a very primitive stage of sort of gender studies. Even though we've been around forever, the knowledge and you know, anything accurate about us, all of these, you know, taxonomies and categories and graphs and chart were just absolutely irrelevant and are laughable today. And at the time, I just could not relate. There was nothing there. And but I'm careful to say that somehow I knew something especially early, because there were so many generations before me, you know, who were kind of steering by, you know, their wits, and kind of doing it or not doing it. But yeah, it was, I think maybe anything before 2000, 2010 probably does look deeply primitive.
Yeah, I was telling Diana before the event that her memoir made me think of the Patti Smith Just Kids, even though it's not that long ago, to me anyway, because of my age, it seems like yesterday. But you're really capturing an era that is no longer here.
And you know, in Just Kids, a memoir I love, in Just Kids, you do see trans people. You know, you do see crossdressers, and you know, they walk across her pages because there she was on 23rd Street and, you know, in certain areas and, you know, this intersection of the arts. But I think what she was witnessing was the advent of AIDS. Mm-hmm. And, you know, the gay people before a lot of gay rights. And, you know, so she kind of saw that piece of history.
Yeah. I have a memoir question. You have a forthcoming essay in LitHub, or has it the one you sent to me?
I think it's Monday.
Okay.
It's coming, but I sent you a
here's the
copy.
preview. You wrote, every writing project has natural enemies or obstacles, and I'd venture to say that a piece of writing is great in proportion to the obstacles it has overcome. I like that quote. But what were some of the obstacles you had in writing this?
All right. Well, I don't want to claim I overcame them. That's up to the reader to decide. You'll be the judge. But I did.
But you wrote it, so.
Well,
yeah.
I did have that conception of what makes a work great. It's actually coming right from Thoreau. Thoreau has a passage in Walden where he talks about, he measures each lake in the area, and he notices that the deepest lakes also have the tallest hills around them. And then, you know, like a good transcendentalist, he tries to get an axiom of ethics from that. And he says, you know, it's people who grow up in mountainous circumstances that are often the deepest. The obstacles of this book, well, one of them, which I mentioned in the article, was that it seemed to be changing before my eyes when I started writing. A passage I was initially happy with, like, okay, you know how you feel as a writer, like, I think I finally might have nailed that to the page. These words seem to stick to the page. I'd look at it again, and a couple weeks later, it's like, this is lies. Not only did I not nail it, I don't even agree with it. Like, what the hell is going on here? And it just seemed very elusive to try, and it's probably not unique to a trans writer, but still there was a lot of history going on, there was a lot of change going on, and I had yet to articulate the problem of language, fully with myself. So that was one of the obstacles. And in the piece that Susan mentions, I call it the books I read while I wrote my book. And I start talking about Ferrante and how not only is she able to do a lot of complexity, she looks for it. She relishes it. In fact, in the beginning of those magnificent Neapolitan novels, there's the dramatis personae in the beginning with all the people and all the families, and it takes 5 pages for it. And she just loves these knotty, tangled webs. And I made a rule for myself: never simplify in my writing what was complex in reality. And there was no fancy technique she showed me other than how worth it is to stick with the hardest passages. It's just that. Don't be satisfied unless it fully, 2 weeks later, you still agree with it. And there were some other things as well with the obstacles. I think there were 2 in particular with regard to the content. One you've already kind of seen is the trickiness of sexualizing transness. And a lot of writers will not do this. A lot of trans writers will not do this because, saying you're turned on by women's clothes, for example, it subjects you to simplification, to reduction, but later on I say, why? Why did this happen? And why did I change? And how did that go? And rather than avoid the topic completely, I took the risk of allowing transphobic people to say, well, you see, it's just a fetish. And I decided, no, let's just have it all out here. Let's just do this, and let's treat it at different points, along the way. So that was some thorny stuff I decided to walk into. And then another obstacle had to do with the theme of child abuse, which comes in part 2 of the memoir. And this is another reductive thing that transphobic critics are aching to do to us, especially nowadays. Oh, you see, there's no such thing as gender identity. It's just, a function of abuse. It's a trauma response. And by going into that, I kind of lay myself bare for that. And as well for trans writers, other trans people who may be critical, why did you do that to us? Why did you expose us to that criticism? But, this stuff happens, and how am I going to make a space for this without it hijacking the entire memoir, which it kind of did to my life? What do we make of this without ignoring it? And a big inspiration for that was Virginia Woolf, who threw in this part about Septimus and Mrs. Dalloway, knowing, because I was reading her diaries, knowing that the critics are just going to criticize. They're going to have it out with her and dismiss her for putting in this character, this shell-shocked war veteran who has nothing to do, it seems, with this lady who doesn't even know him throwing a dinner party. What do we do with that? And she fought to keep Septimus, she fought hard. She hardly wrote much those days when she called it the mad part. And I decided to write the mad part. And again, I can't say if I succeeded, but I wanted that abused kid in the book, right, with that trans kid, because it was hard to tell one from the other for a long time.
At what point did you know you were going to write memoir? And I mean, you're talking about obstacles in the writing and the material, but you got yourself to write memoir? Did it take a while to get to that point?
I think it did. It was those early efforts when I first felt good and then I felt horrible about what I wrote. Writing for the American Scholar, which I think is up the road, DuPont Circle. So it's a DC book. Writing for the American Scholar, these nonfiction columns, was such a pleasure. These 600-word maximum columns, one after another. There were 31 essays in the series. And toward the end of it, my editor there, Bruce Falconer, said, this has to be a memoir. So sometimes you need another person just egging you on a little bit. And I'm thinking, okay, let me think about this. And, and he said, I know some agents. He's an incredibly generous editor. But it wasn't ready, but he planted the seed. And then it was just sort of rolling around for a year or two. And, but it wouldn't sit still for me. I wasn't happy with it. And then I talked to Laurie Shapiro, the writer, the historical writer, great. She's working on a book about Amelia Earhart right now. Amelia Earhart's love life. Hello. And I had coffee with Laurie Shapiro. And I was telling her, oh my God, I feel like I'm in a doldrum. I'm the only poet Laurie likes. Like, she hates poets, but she likes me. She says, so she thinks I have something special. And Laurie said, can I be the boss of you for 5 minutes? And knowing Laurie Shapiro, I said, you get 30 seconds. She goes, okay, here's what you're going to do. Because I wasn't dating anyone at the time. It's like, what's going to happen to me? And she said, this is what you do. Forget about dating. You're going to write a memoir. And it's going to be a hit. And after that, the women will come up to you. I know you have something. Send me something. Okay, fine. So I sent Laurie one of these chapters. It turned out to be the chapter called Femme Fever. So I sent her this Femme Fever chapter. That one, it seemed to be sticking to the page okay. And she went on Facebook, and she told all her Facebook friends, I just read something from a writer, and it just stopped me cold. I've had 2 of these feelings ever in my life. She's unagented. What can you do? And Laurie Shapiro has a social IQ of about 1 million. So she's got all these Facebook friends. She didn't tell me she did this. She just texted me and said, go on Facebook. And all these people are thrilled. And this is like the Me Too version of you should write your memoir. It probably takes 1,000 people telling you, no, write this memoir. They haven't even read it. And I said, okay, so I wrote this to get dates. That's the answer.
That's a good answer. Well, there were many things that stopped me cold when I read this. And I read it about a year ago, and they stuck with me. And one of them is the passage that where you're describing the allure of women, talking about someone you saw on a train when you were. I wondered if you wanted to read that. It's page 67.
Okay. Would you mind if I formally step to the podium so I don't have to hold this mic?
Yes.
67?
Yes.
Okay.
Or thereabouts. That was in the hardcover.
Yeah, I'll read a few of these. It's 3 paragraphs. So this is me trying to figure out what the hell is this, and there's these 2 things batting around in my mind. Is this some kind of enlightened, forward-thinking way of approaching gender, or am I just complete mess? There was a glamorous short-haired woman I saw a couple mornings each week on the subway to work. We both boarded the front of the train at Court Street. She favored tailored skirt suits, sheer hose, classic pumps, deep red lipstick, and stud earrings. Often I'd see her doing the New York Times crossword puzzle in pen. I wondered where she got the discipline to ignore her magnificent hand holding the pen, her slender fingers and bright red nails, to focus on a clue asking for a river in Central Asia. I had my puzzle, and she had hers. Then she stepped off at Wall Street to figure out the New York Stock Exchange. I knew that I viewed women through a completely fucked up lens, yet knowing this did not affect that view. It was like having 2 selves, The reasonable self that insisted, "You're a man, don't complain," was unable to get through to the wild self that kept flying out of my body to inhabit passing women. And possibly there was a third self to eroticize the whole situation, a voyeuristic self that was as wretched as the half-naked masturbators at the Vault, which was this S&M club that let trans people come. When the papers reported the suicide of a fashion model who threw herself off an Upper West Side balcony, it confounded me. Why would a beautiful woman ever do that? Whatever her problems were, I would have changed places with her in a heartbeat. I fantasized a scenario where I'd rush into her apartment in time to save her. I find her on the balcony and try to convince her not to jump. I tell her how beautiful she is, though she's tired of hearing that. Maybe it's what got her into this mess. I point to the amazing wardrobe in her closet and drawers full of magnificent underthings. Why would you want to give this up? I plead. She looks at me funny. Though I have bought some time, I try to tell her how lucky she is to be in her body and praise her proportions and curves, her beautiful hair and smooth skin, the magnificent flatness of her crotch. What kind of a sicko are you? She says, throwing a second leg over the balcony rail. Now get the fuck out of here so I can kill myself in peace.
Another image that stopped me cold and that also stuck with me for a year is you describe being a child and a woman with dark hair walks into your family home. And that leads me to I'm not sure how to get the question out, but a question about epiphanies. Because
the epiphany, yes.
It seems like there are a number of epiphanies in the book, and that's one of them. And then another one when you're at a retreat, right, toward the end.
Yeah.
And then
Very
another
much so.
one, sort of a epiphany in hindsight that comes from your poem, Backflip. So I don't know if you can find a question in what I'm saying, but
I think at the time, this was one of my discoveries while I was writing, you can't understand an epiphany ever, because the epiphany is what understands you. You know, there's all this talk about gender as a social construct or whatever. All I can say is that's not my experience. All I can say is that for me and for people I know, gender is as deeply sensed as gravity. And you ignore it at your peril. And, you know, this identity, I am quite sure, predates, if not me, then certainly my understanding of it, which is, I think, what makes the epiphany so explosive, is you can't outrun it with thinking. And I've tried. I've tried every trick in the book. And, there's a certain category, whether you're theistic or not, there are certain mental events that are not dreams, that are not daydreams. They have a life. They last. You don't have to take notes. They're in you. They happen. And I just can call them mental events. And they have as much impact or perhaps more than a lot of lived events, because they are lived. It's just you don't have a place to locate them, a little like how it's so hard to locate gender identity if you're trans. Because if you did locate it, you'd have to transition. And if you did that, you might not survive, you know, going back to this time or even lately, you know. So, there was a place for that without mentioning any theory of God or anything like that. These things just kind of popped in. And there was one that came as words, in fact. It had to do with child abuse. It was this voice that said, "You will never be in a room with this woman again." And it came through so resoundingly that I looked around the table that included my mother and my brother and my sister-in-law, wondering if they heard it too. I mean, that's how, these things knock you sideways. I think we've all had these things come to us, and probably best not to ignore them.
Well, before we turn to questions, so start thinking of your questions, I wondered if you might read or recite the poem Backflip, which, if you want to, you don't have to. But it's sort of that's what I was saying, has Epiphanies embedded in it before you even got to where you are.
Yeah, I wrote this poem Backflip in 2010. So it was, years before I came out to myself in 2014. So probably before 2010. I was living in Oklahoma at the time, and I just wrote this poem that was, poets being the antenna of the race, it was at least predictive of my personal one-person race. And I didn't know it at the time. And so I end the book with it because I'm at a reading. It's the only reading I ever gave when they wanted an encore. Someone shouted encore. And it was the first reading I gave having transitioned, and I didn't think any of the poems were really about being trans. I don't care. I'll write on anything I want. I always will. But then as I read it, I realized, no, the backflip, I know what the backflip is now, finally. So I've kind of updated it in the version I've memorized. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's even better.
Okay. Backflip. I bet I could do a backflip right now. I've got a feeling they're not as hard as we think. They're just dangerous. I'm thinking of going for it right here in my living room with no witness except for the dog. Only the dog will know my secret power. Or let's say I am in an appliance store where two men are stealing televisions, and I did a backflip, causing one of them to say to the other through his ski mask, why do you think that blonde lady did a backflip? And in that moment of hesitation, the authorities swoop in to nab them. Or what if I were caught in an embarrassing lie at a dinner party, and instead of trying to explain myself, I calmly stepped away from the table and executed a backflip, causing my friends to say, what an unusual thing for Diana to do. I had not expected that, thus revealing a facet of myself far more worthy of conversation than the embarrassment moments earlier, all because of a backflip, which, as I say, I can probably do right now, for I have maintained bodily flexibility and core through my 30s into my 40s. Plus, I'm generally good at committing to things which I'm guessing would be a key to effective backflipping. I see it as no harder than the leap your average TV detective makes from one rooftop to another, which only looks hard because it's high up. Plus, they're wearing suits and ties, the pursuit of criminals being a formal occasion. Anyhow, I bet I can cover that, no problemo. And not just me, but you too. And that's my point. A lot of us could do a backflip. We have no idea of what we're capable of. And this is how the world keeps us in check. Everyone, except for the stuntmen and the ones who go off and join the circus, or tear up their passports and go native, or change their sex and become lounge singers, or stand their ground in front of a tank. If I do this backflip, there's no telling what I'll do next. Or I could remain an ordinary civilian, humble and quiet as I've been, though with the knowledge of what I'm capable of buzzing inside me. Thank you. It's fun being a poet.
Now I just want to do a poetry reading, but I think we'd better turn to the Q&A.
Thank you for writing this book, Diana.
You are welcome, Melissa.
Um,
This is Melissa Scholes-Young, everyone, a very fine writer.
Speaking of poetry, that's really actually what my question is about, because you and I have such rich conversations about craft, and I've known you almost 15 years now, to watch and know you first as a poet and as an editor, and then to read your essays from American Scholar, and now to read this gorgeous, incredible, stunning book. I wonder if you could talk for a minute about craft and genre and how you do each of these so distinctly, and also what is maybe the overlap you see within each of them, and how do you do what you do? How do you write so many genres well?
Oh, you're too kind. I don't have... Well, here's my not so good answer. I kind of have the same approach to everything. I know prose is different from poetry. We were talking about this before. I mean, one of the obstacles for a poet writing, here's another obstacle, for a poet writing poetry is poets are notorious for not being able to keep the damn thing moving. So I was mindful of that, as I was writing, but I happen to be a narrative poet, so, I know a little about that, keeping it moving. But there's not one thing I wouldn't want from, good prose that I also wouldn't want from good poetry. Compression, good sound, good images, break a heart. So I knew I was in a different genre, I guess, but I felt like the same parts of my brain were firing no matter what I was writing. And I think also, I don't think I was an imposter as a poet, all those books, but I did always come from a narrative place. And I tended to have a style that readers in the middle of my poems, if it's going well, they kind of don't even know they're in a poem. I don't want them to have to feel like they're doing the hard labor. Although I'll write in form and rhyme and things like that, and you always know you're in a poem when it's a rhyme. So I think, from the beginning, I always wanted to be just a narrative writer and a storyteller, whether it's poetry or whatever. Same with essays. I mean, essays move a lot like poems as well. So, well, Laurie Shapiro says the next step is, because she's the boss of me, that I'm going to write a novel next. So, no, it's just what Laurie Shapiro says. I called her up about these dates. I said, Laurie, what you got any update about the dates that are supposed to? Because I wrote the damn memoir for you. So,
Can we all get her number?
I put her first in the acknowledgments. That's why we had that coffee.
There was a question. Okay, well, you're next.
When I was growing up, there were always some people who were tomboys or effeminate males, and they might have been crossdressers or practicing homosexuality, but they were able to preserve the ability to have biological children. And I wonder if there's pressure to transition nowadays that is making it impossible for people to preserve those options.
Thank you for that. I think the goal of most trans people I know is to be alive when they're 40. And if that's your goal, I mean, we're talking about a minority under siege. And if that's your goal, you're kind of giving up on the American dream in order to just be breathing at age 40. A lot of the people from that chapter I read never made it out of the 20th century. So I could talk medicine. We generally don't, because we don't want to further medicalize ourselves. I can tell you about what all kinds of trans people do to preserve the ability to have kids. Even kids transitioning now, There are procedures, there are ways. It's actually not that different from gay couples having families and being parents, being great parents, okay parents, mistake-prone parents, whatever, parents. But the emphasis now is on not dying and not getting murdered. That really is the emphasis. I resisted putting a lot of medical things here because people nowadays can look that up on Wikipedia. So this may be an unsatisfying answer, but the emphasis is, on saving your life. But there are ways, to do this. One of the biggest dangers we have comes from not having a childhood in your gender. And that's something I've said in public. I've started to say this in public. And I think 100% of people, trans people, people who are not trans, can try to contemplate. We can all do this and see how catastrophic it is. Can you picture not having a memory of a childhood in your gender? Because there's not a single trans adult I know who possesses that. And there's not a single cisgender adult who doesn't. And now picture going through puberty in the wrong gender and the horror of that. That's going to take precedent over everything else. We're talking about a minority with a 7 times the suicide rate of the general public. And I happen to think the biggest mystery behind so-called dysphoria, because nobody quite knows what causes it. I think what causes it is not having a childhood in your gender, far more than your body. It's this identity that has no answer. And so we were talking about this before. You wind up feeling like this black hole who can't take up space. The only statistic that's close to this, I actually mentioned this in the Lit Hub piece, an exponential suicide rate to the general public is closed adoptions. 4 times the suicide rate of the general. There's a fantastic article in the New Yorker by a woman named Larissa McFarquhar about I didn't want it to end. It was so well written and well done and so informing. And I think there's something identical to the 2 states is this essential ingredient of knowing yourself is missing in both cases at some really important points along childhood development. So that's the emphasis. Are we going to be alive? But there are ways, and you can look them up.
Another question?
Thank you.
Hi.
Hi, Diana. Looking great. I love the ensemble.
Thank you.
Hair, nails.
Melissa, help me.
Yeah.
We had mani-pedis.
Well, I love the nails, love the sandal. The whole thing just works. Once again, Diana, you just nail it. So nice to see you. I think that you may have caught me very often whispering into my wife's ear over there as you were doing the reading. So I think it's only fair that to tell you what I was saying. When you spoke of Elena Ferranti and how she is drawn to complexity and the 5 pages of dramatis personae in her books, I whispered to my wife, just like Tolstoy. So
Yeah, just like Tolstoy. I compare her to Tolstoy
right,
in
yeah.
the Lit Hub piece. There's a lot in that Lit Hub piece, I guess. You taken together, these 4 novels are of a piece, and taken together, they're longer than War and Peace. And in their way, they're as monumental. It's a monument to women's experience, and in a way unprecedented. Of course, she lists women writers she admires. It's a great book list, actually. You can find it. But in a way, it's unprecedented what she's doing, with women's experience, women's friendship in those novels. Yeah.
Absolutely. I could not recommend her books more highly.
Yeah.
But the other part, though, when I kept whispering to my wife's ear when you were doing your reading, was simply that I basically was saying this, yeah, me too. So, yeah, me too, yeah. Oh, yes, that too. Right, I know the Eulenspiegel Society is in Midtown. Yeah, I know that.
They used to be on West 4th Street.
I know. when did they change that? But even, I would say, yes, the falsetto British accent, I did that too.
Even that?
Even that.
You did false.
I certainly did.
Yeah.
I certainly did. So,
What's up with that?
what it was for me is that I could forget about my boy voice when I was practicing sounding like Vanessa Kirby.
Exactly. They think you're British, so they don't worry about the. Look, I don't know anything about this, but you wind up twisting yourself sideways, and sometimes it's best to just laugh about it.
Oh yeah. Oh, you've got to laugh. If you don't
Yeah.
laugh, you're gonna cry.
Yeah.
You're gonna die.
Yeah.
But no, you gotta laugh. So, I was just struck by. I mean, my experience as a transgender woman is representative of no other trans woman's life except yours. So, and I know the last time we spoke, I had talked to you about writing my own memoir, but I realize now I don't have to do that because you just did it.
No. I think Susan and I were talking a little about this before. I have what I call the everybody test. I'd want this from any piece of writing, And then the everybody test goes with what I call the Passover test. The Passover test is, why is this night different? Why is this trans memoir different from every other trans memoir? If I can't answer that, I'm not writing it. Same with writing an op-ed or a column. If I can't answer that, then the world doesn't need my writing. I'll write something else that answers the Passover question. But the other part of it, which looks different, is the everybody test. Is there a little bit of everybody on every page? No matter how idiosyncratic it is what I'm writing, I want it to speak to anyone with any experience of identity or transitioning. And I think that's why I put the Backflip poem in the back, because I truly believe that everyone has a backflip to make, and also that there's nothing particularly special about mine, in the sense that it has to be equally perilous for all of us. Whatever that bridge you got to cross, the Rubicon you got to sail, it's equally treacherous. It just looks different for everyone. So you've got a backflip book in you. It's just, maybe I've caused you to look harder.
I think you did, and I definitely have. I have a second act. I'm going to do a backflip, because you're right. You achieved the impossible one time, you can achieve it again. May I offer you this phrase, which came to mind as you were doing your reading, from an author whose name I don't remember, but the phrase was people living lives of quiet desperation. And that's what it seemed like so many of the characters that certainly describe my existence for 40 years before, a life of quiet desperation. I was wondering if any of the lives in your memoir, perhaps including your own, is that an apt phrase? Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Yeah, well, that's really an excellent note to end on as we're running out of time. But
It's Thoreau, by the way. Massive men lead lives of quiet desperation. Jenny Boylan wrote an essay, a gorgeous essay, based on the proposition of Thoreau being trans.
Oh.
But you were ending, so let me not.
The every person test, it does have that. I finished reading this and I could relate on a million different levels, and I'm not trans, so it has.
Not yet.
Not yet, right? Well, maybe that's right.
No.
But yeah, that's my plug to buy this book, because it's really beautiful, and I think it will speak to everybody in this room. And I wish you could stay and recite poetry for the rest of the night.
It's fun.
But instead, Diana will be signing books right here, so please pick up a copy. And thank you, and fold up your chairs. And thank you.
And thank you, Susan, and thank you to everybody at Politics and Prose.